regarding the providence of God and free will, and so God's permissive will. So, because I've already heard the answer to this, but I wanted to hear you, Eastern Thomas, on like how you would explain it. But like, let's take a tragedy, for example, like you say 9/11, and
Right.
people ask, why would God permit such a tragedy? Like, what greater good would come out of that? Like, now, like, what would you say to that? Because I've heard the answer to that, and it's not a question I'm asking personally, just for maybe people listening who may wonder that question.
Right. Well, there are two different answers in scholastic thought. I'm going to skip over the Molinist answer because I'm not really a big fan of Father Louis de Molina's views on predestination. However, I'll discuss the view that St. Thomas Aquinas had and the view that Blessed John Duns Scotus had. So St. Thomas Aquinas essentially comes up with the idea that every man has a rational appetite. The rational appetite is essentially the measures by which a man's passions are inclined in a certain manner. And he would basically say that's what a rational appetite is. So a person could have a rational appetite towards alcohol. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be good if a person was drunk and they got drunk all the time. It would not be good that they have a rational appetite towards alcohol. However, a person could also have a rational appetite towards sex, which would also be wrong. That would be lustful. St. Thomas ultimately says that it is only truly befitting that a person have a rational appetite towards God and the supreme good, and towards charity. And so, St. Thomas would say, every action that a person makes, whether it be for pleasure or whether it be for the good of others, ultimately has to be within the purview of charity, which is essentially how God's love is communicated to us and through us. And so he would say, in regards to the rational appetites, he says that God designs the rational appetite in a manner to where a person can dispose it towards temporal things or temporal pleasures like alcohol or sex or lust, or to rightly measure those passions towards God. And St. Thomas would say the reason God does this is because that's within a man's nature. A man's nature is to incline, his passions in one way or another. If God were to, now God certainly moves people. Nobody comes to God unless they're moved, but God doesn't supersede or press cancel on a person's nature. If God did do that, that would be canceling out the nature that God gave a person. And St. Thomas says ultimately because of God's wisdom and God's goodness, he chooses not to do that. But the consequence of that is evil. The consequence of that is that many people are, deprived of God and deprived of the supreme good. And, that ultimately leads to, greater consequences against God. And that ultimately leads to evil in the world. Now, the way Blessed John Duns Scotus describes it is a little different. Blessed John Duns Scotus would say that everything in creation centers around the cross. And so he would actually say that God intentionally willed permissively, not actively, but still willed permissively that sin come into the world because he saw it better that the world fall and then Christ ultimately redeem humanity than for humanity to just kind of go on living without any sort of bump in the road. Now, as you could probably expect, based on the title of my channel and the framework I ascribe to, I generally side with St. Thomas Aquinas on this one. I think that makes more sense within the purview of man's nature. But those are kind of the two arguments that St. Thomas Aquinas and Blessed John Duns Scotus make in regards to God's providence and why certain evils are allowed.
Yeah, I will pull on Callisto's where here, because man, this question of why is there evil in the world is so big, and I like some of these answers, and I actually feel like I could really dive into that idea that there is the cross and that suffering brings us to God. But the one that Callisto's where brings up is love, is that because we were made in the image of God, and we were given this gift of free will, that God took a chance, and to have true love, you had to have free will. And so implicit in that free will means that the evil will happen.
Right. And that's one of the arguments that's probably closer to the argument that St. Thomas would make. St. Thomas mostly makes the argument from participation. So St. Thomas's central argument on the problem of evil is God's plan for humanity wasn't everything goes absolutely right. God's plan was that in that God is love itself, 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. And in that, true love is ultimately the desire, ultimately desiring the good for another. Once you love, once you have something good, and you love someone, you desire that good to be shared to that other person. In the sense that God is love, God chose to freely create so that a person might partake as his co-worker in that perpetual state of loving. Now, the reason why man is free in his rational appetites is A, because that's what pertains to a man's nature, and also B, in the purview of participation. If it weren't that way, then man would just kind of be, kind of a cog in God's sort of overall mind, and participation would completely collapse.
If you like what you see here, make sure to like, comment, and ring that notification bell.